Good day, everyone. It's good to see you. If we can take a moment, thank you for your patience while we did some final kind of technical checks. We appreciate that you're here with us. Welcome back to day 2 of the Funder Retreat. If we can, I'd like to invite you to please turn on your cameras. And let's take a moment to just kind of greet each other, wave at each other, celebrate that we're all here, that you're all prioritizing the time together, and look around to see who you have not yet met. Either send them a message on the chat to welcome them, or make sure to connect using the swap card. Yesterday, Anka showed us how to do it. I'm not going to attempt to do that right now. Maybe she can remind us how to do it. But do take a moment to meet someone new, someone that you have not connected, someone that you want to learn about each other's work. So with that, I'd like to, again, welcome you. We had a fantastic set of conversations yesterday that started with looking back at how last year's conversations, last year's dialogue set us up for this year's retreat. I think we share with all of you how we arrived to this retreat, looking at what you had told us coming out of last year's convening, coupled and informed with the planning committee feedback, as well as with some of the things that I think we have been hearing from the membership. Now, we also invited you to look to the interactive, to kind of share with everyone what had happened since last year. And we're gonna revisit that together in a few minutes. But for those of you that are just joining us today, yesterday we had a fantastic set of dialogues happening. We heard from Mariela Lopez of Pawanka Fan and from Christine Osawa of Samdana Institute about the impact as well as a response of COVID from Indigenous peoples. Really focusing not only on the resiliency, but also the agency and the mobilization and the self-governance aspects of how Indigenous peoples responded to COVID. We also heard from Galina Angarova from Cultural Survival, as well as from Jennifer Tauli Corpus of Niatero about Indigenous rights self-determination in the context of the climate urgency. Both of them had happened to just got back from COP26, so we also had the opportunity to hear first accounts from them as to what were some of the outcomes, some of the drawbacks, some of the still areas of concern. And we touched on some of the philanthropic commitments that 5 of our IFIP members have made, in addition to other philanthropic commitments that have been made in connection to the recent climate COP. And now, what I like to do, like I said, all of you inform mural, which Anka is about to show us. And I'd like to take a few minutes to just go over what you all share with us as to what has happened since last year. There's a number of different actions that have happened, and I just want to take a moment to just look it over with you. And Anka, when you're ready, please share your screen. And if you can zoom in, because I'm not going to be able to read that.
You can't, Lourdes. What I just wanted to say before we start is when we were clustering this yesterday, it was really amazing to see everything that Lourdes is going to take us through. And if you can see down here, there's really almost a lot of things that happened last year that were very internal to you all, to your teams and your organizations. And then we move along the spectrum and we go and we end to external. So Lourdes, I'll hand it over to you and we'll start with internal.
Perfect, thank you. And maybe if you want to put it on the chat too, so if people want to start taking a look. So I thought that we first start with, we don't know who put this sticky, but I want to celebrate the fact that we're welcoming someone new who's moving into this space for the first time. And that's a big one. I see it as a big celebration because we need more philanthropic actors moving into this space. And then, and I'm gonna have to put my glasses because I can't still read that. And then we looked at some of the other comments that you all put. How do you all respond then, changing some of your processes, reviewing your granting processes through a culturally sensitive lens, as well as simplify your applications and reporting processes. We also noticed that some of you also publish or commission learning and landscape scans, including IFIP, which published the Indigenous Ways of Giving and Sharing Landscape Report on Indigenous-led funds. We have someone from Track B who commissioned a first simple historical scan for Indigenous-led funds in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. We need more of those scans, definitely, and that's something that I think you'll hear us talking about on day 3. We also have, and I'm not going to read all the stickies, maybe I'll just going to pick 1 or 2 because we have several actions, but the last one that I'll pick from here is the True Cost Initiative, engage in developing intentional learning agenda, and have one of your agenda categories for deeper understanding on Indigenous people's rights, and how they connect with the corporate accountability and strong legal systems, which is very crucial. We know corporations are one of the actors that we need to continue to influence because of all the violations of rights that they can cause if we don't keep them accountable. Anka, just tell me where I'm going if you want to move the screens. So now we have a cluster of high-level involvement and impact, starting with IFIP member in New England and Biolabs Foundation, who organized a session at the IUCN World Conservation Congress as a precursor to the CBD and Climate COP, or a specific panel under their Reimagining Pavilion, but a specific panel on reimagining philanthropy and exploring particular Indigenous-led funds. And as well, some actions that IFIP has been engaged with over the last year. Like I said yesterday, and I think on Track B, our engagement on the International Philanthropy Commitment for Climate Change, really advocating and ensuring that Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, human rights, and addressing the root causes were part of the final text of that commitment. And more recently, connection to the COP, I've presented at the Philanthropy for Climate roundtable hosted by a number of European organizations or networks in philanthropy. And like that, we have many other actions that you've taken, strengthening your teams, which we talk about a lot, not only through the Learning Institute, but through other opportunities for learning through webinars, how important it is to continue to do and take the time to build the capacity of your team. The focus on well-being, I think, as you've seen from the participation, particularly also from Indigenous Climate Action yesterday, it needs to take more center stage, and perhaps more of a reflection or a comment from me and from IFIP to think about how You can also support both focus of well-being, but also focus on healing justice. You all continue to work and participate on networks. Maybe you can move up or move more to the, I guess, to the other side. So yes, we have someone that joined the Circle on Philanthropy. I think that is up in Canada, which is great. You know, Chris Archie and her team are doing a fantastic job in Canada to also mobilize and transform Canadian philanthropy, and created relationship with many new First Nations with a goal to connect to other funders. And like that, other actions connecting to influencing and growing networks. And Anka, if you can move. But one other thing where we see in some of them, a lot of the different work that you all been busy doing is with increasing support and funding to Indigenous-led funds and Indigenous-led organizations. And that couldn't please me any more, because that's exactly what IFIP it has been talking about, the importance to do more direct funding, particularly also in support of Indigenous-led funds who have the agency, who have the understand the cultural protocols, and how to support Indigenous communities. And I'm not going to touch on all of them because there's quite a few, but please take time and make sure you're connecting with the attendees who represent those foundations, those funders, to learn how they're doing it. And then another category where is it improve non-Indigenous-led funds approaches. From Adrian Apple, who is on track B. He's from a First Nation from Australia, worked with other foundations on their First Nations engagement and giving. And I think this speaks to their role. Particularly, he's the lead for the First Nations funding and the funding trust where he works. So just the role of ensuring that as a staff of foundations, you all have also that ability to influence other funders. One more, let's see, climate-related work. Fund Indigenous-led response to climate-related emergencies. This is one of, I think, a topic that we touched on and yesterday, and we're going to continue to kind of work through. Since we know that the results of COP26 were not really what we were hoping they would be. Digital storytelling, and one of the tracks that I was seeing yesterday, track A, I believe, one of the dialogues, there was conversations around the need to do narrative change, informed by Indigenous communicators or our storytellers. So it's great to see that some of you are also working on that. Yes, emergency funds for at-risk. I believe a lot of this has to do not only for supporting defenders by creating a Fondo Defensores to support Indigenous rights defenders in Latin America, but also to address some of the emergencies and perhaps thinking that some of these were tied to COVID, but many of them tend to be also be tied to rights violations and encroachment on their territories. Thank you, Anka, for moving the screen. Youth focus support. We would love to see more of this at IFIP, and I know we've mentioned it before, but I'm really thinking about how do we commit to making sure that as part of our attendees, as part of the speakers, we have representation from youth. We heard yesterday from, I believe, one of the speakers, the importance of the supporting the transition of leadership and the intergenerational transfer of knowledge for the next generation of Indigenous leaders. Anka, maybe a couple of more so that we can just share the report back. Indigenous lawyers, we definitely need more of those. It's great to see that Christensen and Neotera are thinking of ways of supporting Indigenous lawyers to advance rights of Indigenous peoples. So maybe what I'll just stop there. Take a moment to visit the mural. This is all the work that you have been busy doing over the last year since the retreat. It's fantastic to see that that last year convenings are yielding some results by the fact that you all have been busy thinking about this work and thinking of ways of changing how you do your giving. So with that, I think I'm going to stop. One of my team members is going to be sharing with you the report back from last night, or my last night, track B report backs.
Of distrust or trust being depleted. So
can you hear it now?
So in terms of the first question, which was around transition and recovery, we all spoke about having to address the lack of engagement with First Nations community and the history of distrust or trust being depleted during colonisation, and that we needed to address government's investment or lack thereof in Indigenous-led organisations. They seem to start investing during an emergency, but they should have been invested in right from the start in planning and rolling out any initiatives within their own communities. And this includes basic investments in things like housing, food, water and energy. And we need to we discussed how these are basic human rights, and it shouldn't have taken a pandemic for them to be considered. We also, despite where people came from in the globe, there was a real consensus that there needed to be far more coordination between sectors, including things like industry, farming, government with First Nations communities, and that we needed to increase networks, and that we also needed to increase and amplify all voices in community, which included young people who were often not at the table with decisions which were made about them, like returning to school or not returning to school. In terms of solutions, again, we had consensus that these solutions actually exist in community. We saw that during the pandemic, they proved themselves time and time again to be able to respond rapidly and effectively and appropriately. Meanwhile, large organisations that often receive large investments were very slow and clunky and could not get out to the communities that needed the most. And that there was this real sense that, having demonstrated this, community-led organisations and First Nations people should get on the offensive. They shouldn't always have to be defending their country and their culture and their patch, but they should actually be out there in front of it. And that we wanted to start measuring scale, and this was a wonderful thing that Christy said, scale should be measured based on reach, not organisational size. And if we started to measure like that, community organisations would always come out front. And that responses by First Nations community were best practice, not just for First Nations people, but for all people often in communities, and that we saw a real leadership role and a real opportunity to sort of harness tens of thousands of years of expertise in our country. What philanthropy could do more of is what a lot of people were doing during the pandemic, was reducing reporting, increasing flexibility and giving autonomy with funds. This should happen always, not just in a pandemic. And we need to start thinking more creatively about our processes, incorporating oral processes and relational processes, not just written transactional ones. And we need to fund not just for now, but for the future. We need to build relationships and connect deeply and not wait for a crisis to do this. Those relationships need to already be there. We need to consider institutional strengthening, so strengthening First Nations-led organisations, and build on and invest in the assets of culture and country. So we kind of flipped that to sort of not capacity building. Already capacity existed in communities, but how could we build on that? And that included possibly investing more into Indigenous-led funds and or building mechanisms for decision-making by First Nations people in non-Indigenous-led funds, but always being accountable to those practices. There was lots more, but that's all I can fit in for now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was quite a lot already. I'm really excited to dig into those notes. And I also see a lot of similarities with, while you guys were having a discussion, I was cleaning up the mural and kind of clustering everything that's happened this past year, right? And so I'm really happy to see a lot of those similarities, because there is already, a lot of movement, a lot of positive movement forward. So that's a great sign. And just a reminder that we will be looking forward, starting a little bit tomorrow and then more day 3. So we're going to be able to get to work on what these things look like and what concrete actions we can take. So I'm really excited to hear more about that. Okay, amazing summary. Can we go to breakout 2? Rachel, from your group, who's going to be presenting?
Natalie is going to be presenting for us.
Welcome.
Thank you. Come on, muted. Excellent. We were a small group, but it was a lovely discussion. I'm not sure if you're still there, but please do also jump in, and Lourdes and Rachel as well. So I would start by saying I think that there are quite strong correlations to both discussions based on what Rachel just described and discussed, and I think track A's discussions as well. So in the first question, and Jing was with us for a moment, but she had to leave the group, so her notes are here, and I'll do my best to reflect those. But the first question was really about what lessons we are learning during this time, particularly through the lens of climate change. And I guess that the first underlying lesson is that Indigenous peoples' territories and rights are literally under threat from climate change and climate solutions, and human rights is core, and we can't look at climate change and climate solutions without also looking at human rights and the rights of First Nations peoples, and that I think is read through everything that we discussed in the conversation. Governments are committing huge amounts of money, and they're not necessarily embedding Indigenous knowledge, and that is both a lost opportunity, but also potentially causing great harm and long-term trauma for communities and First Nations peoples and traditional owners. I think on the positive, though, we talked about the rhetoric shifting and the concept that sometimes the rhetoric has to shift and it takes time for the change to happen. They start talking the talk, and then walking the walk sometimes can just take a long time, and we are seeing some of the talk changing, and we are starting to see some of that acknowledgement of ancient wisdom of First Nations people being at least in the rhetoric. It's not being backed with the resourcing yet. I think that mirrors some of what Rachel was just describing from the other conversation. We are also starting to see, I think, promising trends around the connections between the mainstream dialogue about food production, agriculture, energy production, etc., being connected with caring for country and with traditional land management practices, etc., which is encouraging, and we are starting to learn that when that is invested in well, and when those power imbalances around particularly the political level and major economic investment level, that we do see better solutions, and we are seeing more sustainable climate change solutions, and they are being led from the local level. So I think it's really mirroring the conversations as well about needing to have First Nations perspectives and wisdoms out front, rather than being called upon after the fact. So hopefully there's a number of initiatives that are helping that to happen. And it is about more than money. It is actually about whole systems and whole governments and policy shifts, which is bigger than any one player and one actor, and does need to be influenced from a range of angles. So the second question was really about how we individually and collectively can respond in this moment. And there's a call to action, I suppose, there, particularly as philanthropy organisations and for Indigenous-led funds to demand that the pledges that are being made in the likes of the COP summit, that Indigenous self-determination rights are really embedded in those pledges, and that there's an advocacy voice and an influential role that we can play. We also talked a lot about the need to strengthen the ecosystem of First Nations organisations as well as First Nations funds. And there can be a tendency in philanthropy to invest heavily in a small number of organisations, and that might be to some of the conversations earlier about scale versus reach. If we think about the ecosystem and really investing in strengthening organisations across the ecosystem, that will support a more enabling environment for transitioning power, but also for greater self-determination overall. We also talked about the potential ways that we could collaborate and support and learn from each other. And again, the really focus on supporting the ecosystem was talked about quite a bit there. We also talked about the need to amplify stories and amplify the value of place-based approaches as well, and locally led solutions, and that organisations like IFIP and also pledges such as Philanthropy for Climate, which Lord has kindly shared some information about, are platforms that we can utilise to really advance that, I guess, that leveraging of stories. And we also talked about within that the need to apply a climate lens in our work as philanthropists. And I think just one further comment that I should have mentioned earlier is in the growing dialogue about climate solutions, natural capital is starting to be talked about as an asset that has financial value. And it's important to recognise that natural capital is Indigenous capital. It is the capital of First Nations people as custodians of country. And so that's a message that could be lifted and reframed. I hope I've captured discussion adequately.
Thank you, Winnie, for sharing. The report back of the two of the dialogues that happened on Track B yesterday. First one with Rachel Carey, who was reporting back on the conversation of the response of COVID, and the second one with Natalie on the conversation around the urgency of supporting Indigenous peoples and self-determination in the context of the climate crisis. So what I'd like to do now is welcome everyone who has been joining us. If you're only joining us the first time, this is day 2. We're gonna go into a dialogue conversation, and we have 3 incredible speakers who are gonna lead us through that conversation. Then I believe after that, Anka is gonna share some of more information about the retreat, and then I believe we go into break and come back to participate on the breakouts. So as you hear from the speakers, start thinking about which breakout you want to go into and to participate and continue dialogue. Again, this retreat is being set up to go deeper in dialogue, so we have created a lot of time and space to do that. Anka, is there anything else? We're good?
Yes. Let me just, before we hear from our speakers, I'd love to present to remind everyone who was here yesterday and to present for the first time the core question of day 2 to kind of get us in the mindset, and then we'll hand it over to the speakers. How does that sound? So for everyone who is new, welcome. We're really excited to have you here. We are in day 2 of the IFIP retreat of 2021. I just wanted to quickly go over what we did yesterday. So yesterday we looked at how did we get here? We just looked at the mural and saw all of the amazing things that you all have done in this past year or so. And we also just heard a report back from Track B to remind us of the conversations that we had. And today we're going to think about where are we? Where are we today? And what do we want and need? And today, unlike yesterday, we're going to have 3 breakouts that are happening simultaneously. One is going to be about how does solidarity look like for us in addressing the continued impact of racism and colonialism in Indigenous peoples globally today. Breakout 4 is about ensuring effective and meaningful representation of intersectional groups with Indigenous communities. And breakout 5, we're going to talk about moving forward, decolonizing philanthropy. Where are we and what's needed? So you guys have already started talking about this. We very much saw that Track B was already starting to talk about this a little bit yesterday. Today is the day where we want to go even deeper. And with that, Lourdes, I'll hand it back over to you so you can introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Anka. So if I can invite to the spotlight to introduce Janine Jassy, who is going to be leading us through the conversation, both her conversation as well as facilitating the breakout on how does solidarity look like in addressing racism and colonization. We have now Janine on the spotlight. Great, thank you. So Janine, let me just take a moment to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who don't know Janine, Janine is a community organizer and a human rights advocate that has worked on development and energy issues with Indigenous communities across the United States for the past 12 years. She's a co-founder of 6 World Solutions, and co-founder of the Navajo Nation Little Colorado River Watershed Chapters Association. She has built expertise in infrastructure policy, integrated land and water management, and restoration and protection of traditional ecological knowledge system. She's also engaged on the international work with her current role as Sustainable Development Program Coordinator for the International Indian Treaty Council, and is a co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group of the UN High-Level Political Forum on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So Janine, I give you the floor.
Lourdes, thank you. Thank you, relatives, for inviting me to be here today. Just a slight correction. I recently left my work with IATC and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group to focus more on building on the ground solutions with my communities. And so context matters, right? Coming to you all to answer and provide a framing around this very important question that it really is rooted in the work that I've been doing in the space of Indigenous rights locally and championing that with my own Dene communities in and around the Navajo Nation, but as well as that work and that experience internationally. Being able to combine those 2 experiences and working with philanthropy, particularly in the area of facilitating diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, our DEI trainings with philanthropic organizations. There's been a revelation of a lot of interesting issues and challenges that continue to create barriers to just and equitable redistribution of resources. Many of those barriers and challenges inhibiting the type of transformational shifts that everyone is talking about and everyone wants and needs and recognizes is very important to the work, continues to be rooted in the lack of consciousness around white supremacy culture and the ways that it exists everywhere. It's so hard for a lot of the people that I work with to reconcile that this nation, the United States, and all its institutions are founded not only in white supremacist values and characteristics, but also the legacy of settler colonialism, as is Canada's and as is many developed nations. This lack of consciousness is made even more dangerous when it comes to, when it translates into being unable not only to confront white supremacy, but to also name and confront those values of settler colonialization that continues to be perpetuated in a lot of work and manifested in a lot of alliances and networks and partnerships, even as they relate to global networks. When that happens, we end up, whether we intend to or not, centering the same values of power and control of peoples and planet, even as we try to fund and shift resources to the solutions to this very unsustainable and unbalanced way of being. So solidarity cannot happen until these realities are understood and confronted. Towards this end, I offer 2 learnings. The first one being that white supremacy cultural characteristics can exist within an organization, even if they improve the diversity of their staff. There's a very important reading that I always find very helpful on the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And we use this a lot to help ground the conversation and help organizations recognize that we have to be able to move and have the will to move beyond DEI trainings and actively invest in and work on and shift the entire organizational culture in order to truly achieve equity within philanthropic organizations before we can meaningfully achieve that work in the funding activities. We have to walk the talk. A lot of experience and insights can be gained by confronting those internalized behaviors and the way they manifest and perpetuate systemic oppression, especially as it relates to issues of intersectionality. But racism is tricky, and harmful assumptions and biases persist in philanthropy. It persists in expectations and metrics and goals of funders and the philosophy of funders. Even in the way philanthropy has been taking on and developing new language to support the restructuring of giving structures. Some examples of this, I shared a link to those 8 characteristics of white supremacy. For those who are unfamiliar, please recognize that for many of us, particularly when we're coming from community-led solutions, have to confront these characteristics every day in almost every relationship and every expectation and every conversation that we have with funders. And a lot of this is because some of these white supremacist values are so normalized and that they're considered, that they're considered unthreatening or to the way that we want to envision the type of solidarity and partnerships that need to happen with systemically oppressed peoples or with Indigenous peoples. But we have to do this. Examples of how this manifests in unintended ways, the term BIPOC. So many people are using this term BIPOC, and yet the problem with this term and the way that it shifts and cloaks all of this diversity of life in relationship to whiteness, the diversity of our communities, our historical and ongoing experiences of systemic injustice, and the solutions that we hold in relation to whiteness. But it also completely erases the years of advocacy of Indigenous peoples to be recognized as peoples for the very reason that our self-determination, our inherent rights are vitally important for the preservation of our communities, of our white lifeways, of our cultures, of our languages, and for the foundation of the solutions that we're leading in a world that really needs these solutions. The second thing is that philanthropy has to confront its understanding of systemic oppression using a settler colonialism framework. A settler colonialism framework recognizes that the United States is a present-day settler colonial society whose laws, institutions, and systems of governance continue to reenact the 3 processes upon which the United States was built: Indigenous elimination, anti-Black racism, and immigrant exploitation. That's a quote from the US Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and the Racially Disparate Impacts of COVID-19, written by Monica Kasia. And it's so resonant to the work that we have to do today, because these processes persist in governmental functions as a perpetual assumption of Indigenous peoples as disappearing, or in philanthropy, both as disappearing or sometimes as needing saving. Actively dismantling these biases and assumptions means recognizing that the tools of white supremacy and the ongoing legacies of decolonization effectively come together in the continued threats to the lands, territories, resources, knowledges, lifeways of Indigenous peoples. There's still nothing more dangerous than to be a Black and Brown land and human rights or water rights defender in this day and age of man-made climate change. Indigenous-led solutions, when effectively resourced, threaten those power structures and dynamics by creating alternative pathways for a just and equitable future that does not perpetuate white supremacy or the colonization of Mother Earth and her resources. And those pathways don't just benefit Indigenous peoples, they benefit all peoples and all forms of life. So when we're talking about solidarity, we're talking about solidarity towards that vision, towards that end. That is why philanthropy does not support Indigenous-led solutions. I mean everything from defining the solutions or the issues and where resources are needed to designing and implementing the solutions that the communities feel are needed. If philanthropy doesn't actively support Indigenous-led funds as a necessary step to dismantling unjust power structures, or supporting the development of Indigenous-led funds where they do not exist as necessary to improve the material conditions of Indigenous peoples, then it cannot truly support the work of supporting the self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And so talking about supporting Indigenous peoples and doing it primarily through programmatic funding or practices that do not challenge or dismantle systemic oppression is a lot like practicing land acknowledgement, but doing nothing to help Indigenous peoples achieve the more meaningful goals of land back. For us, combating racial inequality is not about equality in unjust systems, but of upholding the sovereignty and the inherent rights of our peoples. So in our breakout session, we'll have a facilitated discussion on solidarity, and we won't have a whole lot of time, but we will really want to hone in on the fact that we are either ready and willing to confront white supremacy, or we are complacent and continuing to be a part of perpetuating it.
Can I ask that we take a moment, about 10 seconds, to just reflect on those powerful words? Thank you, Janine, for answering the call to be with us today. I'd like to now welcome for our next conversation, Nitaya Shambot of True Coast Initiative, who will be guiding us through this conversation on moving forward and decolonizing philanthropy. Where are we and what's needed? In her current role as program officer, Nitaya cultivates relationships with partners and allies in the field, manages True Cost Initiative grantee partner portfolios, and provides input on the program strategies. She brings to her work insights and perspective gained from over a decade of working directly with disadvantaged and marginalized communities on issues, including youth development, multidimensional impact of dam construction, education, community engagement, racial and gender equity, and cross-cultural learning. With that, I'd like to invite, and for my colleagues to please spotlight Nitaya. You have the floor.
Thank you, Rudas, and thank you for the IFIP team for inviting me to join this important conversation. I'm very honored for this opportunity to share my experience. And so my name is Nitaya Sanbut. As Lauda said, I'm a program officer at True Cost Initiative. And with me today, our whole team at the retreat is Peggy Shu, Vashti Williams, and our Executive Director, Kanil Malak. I think who some of you have heard from in a breakout room yesterday. Just to share a little bit about our work at TCI, which until recently was just a small team of 2, and now we are also we have also grown to be a team of 4 women of color. I would like to start with first sharing briefly about what we do, then how our engagement as an organization with IFIP has led us to commit to supporting Indigenous people rights in the way that we do now. And of course, in commitment to using the I statement, I would share a little bit about my personal journey to where I am today, and how this very journey has also connected me more deeply with my roots. So first of all, at TCI, we partner with organizations around the world and support their work that advance corporate accountability and strengthen legal system with the goal to shift the balance of power so that communities that being made vulnerable and marginalized have the tools and resources to hold companies, corporations, and government accountable for human and environmental rights violations, and for them to really internalize the true cost of their actions and profit. So we partner with groups that use diverse strategies and work at different levels. Some examples include groups that utilize legal empowerment and movement building to support communities who have been harmed or who are struggling against extractive activities. Others, such as Indigenous women's-led groups who work with allies around the world, advocate at international level, while also training younger generation to engage with their own government and pressure government to commit to certain human rights and environmental rights safeguards. We also work with groups that use in-depth investigation into how money flows, who behind large-scale harmful projects, and accompany communities at negotiation tables as they pursue their access to remedy goals. We also support groups that use video, radio, and other media platforms to promote transparency and accountability, and to advocate for their own community, be it building the capacity of local and national journalists through training focusing on environmental reporting, or shifting the narrative and telling stories from the point of view of communities who've been impacted by extractivism, legacies of colonialism and racial oppression, and how all of these connect to sociolinguistics inequalities. These are just some of the examples of the work that we do. While philanthropy in this Western and modern term wasn't something I thought I would find myself in career-wise, I feel fortunate to have found an organization whose mission is aligned with mine. And as I was new to philanthropy, I was fortunate to learn from Indigenous people's perspectives when I joined IFIP in 2019, just a little bit a year after I joined TCI. So Sister Janine, you were one of the faculties, and I continue to learn from you and learn from you, and also, just your teaching and leadership just been, showing us how we can stand up for power. So I think, doing that learning at IFIP in New Hampshire, some of the fundamental learnings and understanding is how money floating around the philanthropy is money that made from the labor and the abuses of Indigenous peoples, Black people, Brown communities. It's from the violations of those living and stewarding their lands and their resources for generation. On that, I left my family when I was 14. And whenever I went back to visit my family, where they live would be kind of like a lean-to structure, and without access to bathroom or proper housing, right next to the building that they are building, right? So I was always wondered and sad why the people who built those big structure, luxurious places are living the way my parents lived. And it was sad then, but now I feel like there are answers to that. So just kind of like thinking about all this through. So it was a journey of, as I facilitated organizations and working alongside with my team and my executive director. So these are the things that I've been, always thinking about. So in terms of how this, our engagement with IFIP help us learn and think and act, is I wanted to, share some of the things that we've been doing. So, among those is, we try to improve our grant making process, our applications, and sometimes when we cannot streamline, we make sure that we are available to work with each of our partners individually. Some of our partners may not have to even submit an application. So we would be there, we would, get up on the phone and talk to them. And then we ourselves kind of, create the application for them. But there's definitely more room even for us ourselves to improve on how we can streamline, right? How can we not working just on case by case, but really make it standardized where access to resources and just grant in general more accessible for Indigenous peoples led groups and initiatives. And when we support work that's led by Indigenous peoples, we also try to make sure that it's general operating support. Obviously, there's limitations and stuff like that, but we make sure that it's gen op. And I think that reflects our trust in how resources should be managed and allocated. And that's by the judgment of Indigenous peoples, our Indigenous leaders, and our Indigenous sisters. So we also support groups that I think Kaniel had made comments around expertise yesterday. At TCI, we try to also expand the meaning of expertise, right? Here, it's like a lot very like technical and that it's create barriers for Indigenous peoples to participate, or even people of colors and in all marginalized groups. And so, with that, we try to support groups that would compensate for the expertise, such as local knowledge. So this is some of the things that we've been doing, and also sharing, helping our partners to be able to travel and be engaged where decisions are made, especially those that will impact them long term. So these are just some of the things that we have been doing, but in terms of like how we move forward, I think everyone here will agree that we need to continue to support Indigenous people-led solutions, and we need to increase that support. So in terms of like thinking about how do we look at different organizations, different communities based on their context. I think the issue of self-determination is one example. We have to be able to, when we support and increase our support, we have to recognize the diversity within and across Indigenous communities. So it can't just be from the US-centric approach and understanding, because each community is operating within a different and diverse political and economic systems. Some communities would need the recognitions as citizens before they can even, claim their Indigenous status. Sometimes if they, even stand up to talk about their Indigenous status, they would be harassed and may face more restrictions in terms of movement. So I think these are some of the complexity we have to really try to understand.
Daya, if I can ask you to, in 1 minute, thank you.
Yeah, so as we are, thinking through what's the next step, I would like to, invite us to be, thinking critically about our own, within our own organization, how can we make, create more space for support for Indigenous people. And so in the next topic, we will, I would like to invite everyone to share your experience, what's worked and what hasn't, and how we collaborate and co-create the support that would shift this power dynamic, not just within, within our society, but also, starting from our own organizations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nita, and thank you for sharing also your personal journey and how you're all thinking about this work at DCI. I'd like to now welcome into the spotlight Teresa Zapeta, who will be sharing with us the topic of ensuring effective and meaningful ways of representation through an intersectional lens, particularly within Indigenous communities. Let me see, I don't yet. Thank you. So welcome, Teresa. Just to quickly introduce you, and I'll be brief, just to be respectful of time. Teresa is Maya from Guatemala, and she's Executive Director of International Indigenous Women Forum, known as FIMI for its acronyms in Spanish. She has extensive experience on, and particularly in Indigenous women's rights, but also in government, at government in Guatemala, and the work that she has been doing also through various other roles that have included with the UNIFEM and UN Women, as well as other roles and organizations where she has played a role as co-founder. With that, I'd like to give you the floor, Teresa. I believe Teresa is going to be sharing in Spanish. So if you take a moment to please find this in the channel that best suits you. And Teresa, go ahead. And just a reminder from the interpreters and transcribers to please speak slow and loud, particularly so the interpreter can hear you. Thank you, Teresa.
Gracias, Lourdes. Muy buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches, dependiendo de dónde se encuentra cada uno. Un momento, creo que mejor me pongo esto para asegurar el audio. Bien. Pues gracias, Lourdes, por la presentación. Voy a tratar de compartirles las reflexiones, algunas lecciones aprendidas en esta tarea y este compromiso de el reconocimiento de las diversidades dentro de nuestros pueblos, tanto la tarea que tenemos como fondos, pero también como pueblos y como fundaciones o comunidad filantrópica. Creo que desde esos tres ámbitos me gustaría compartir algunas reflexiones y aprendizajes. Ya lo decía, soy parte del equipo de FIMI en la dirección ejecutiva. Nosotras somos una plataforma global, un mecanismo global de mujeres indígenas, y en nuestra tarea de facilitar el mecanismo, diálogo, articulación global, definitivamente la diversidad es uno de los valores, porque trabajamos con todas las regiones, las 7 regiones socioculturales de pueblos indígenas en África, Asia, América Latina, América del Norte, el Ártico, África, Rusia. Por supuesto que nuestro trabajo es más fuerte en algunas regiones que otras, por distintas razones que hoy no voy a entrar a detalle, que no es el tema, pero sí empezar diciendo que desde nuestro rol como fondo y como mecanismo global de articulación, la primera tarea que tenemos y que me parece que también se debe de tener en la comunidad filantrópica es reconocer que los pueblos indígenas no somos un pueblo homogéneo. Si bien tenemos valores, principios similares y que nos caracteriza y que es la esencia de nuestro ser como pueblos indígenas, como pueblos originarios, también a lo interno de nuestros pueblos hay una infinidad de identidades. Y empezamos, por ejemplo, en mi caso, o sea, soy una mujer, soy indígena, me reconozco como una mujer sobreviviente del conflicto armado en mi país y vivo en el área urbana, o sea, no soy la mujer rural, como a veces se tiene el estereotipo de los pueblos indígenas, es la mujer que vive en el área rural. Tengo raíces rurales, tengo un vínculo comunitario. Sin embargo, nos vamos a ver en los pueblos indígenas esta gran diversidad también de juventudes, hablamos de diversidades en edades, en ubicación geográfica. No es lo mismo, no son las mismas condiciones las que encontramos, por ejemplo, en las comunidades indígenas de Panamá que con las comunidades indígenas de África. Hay tradiciones, hay costumbres, hay formas de alimentarse diferente. No es lo mismo que esté cerca del mar o del acceso al agua, porque las prácticas y la relación con la naturaleza es diferente que la tiene alguien que está en zonas áridas, por ejemplo. Entonces, ¿a qué viene esta importancia del reconocimiento? Porque esto es lo que nosotros le decimos a los estados cuando decimos que queremos políticas diferenciadas, porque no es lo mismo una política para personas mestizas que para pueblos originarios. Y esto mismo nosotros lo tenemos que llevar y trasladar a nuestros fondos. En el caso de FIMI, que trabajamos desde un fondo de mujeres indígenas, tenemos que estar como con esos lentes bien puestos y atentas a esas realidades, a esas diversidades propias de la organización, de la comunidad con quien estamos conversando. Incluso, por ejemplo, nosotras damos la oportunidad que cuando aplican a los fondos en una convocatoria abierta, si alguien no puede presentar por escrito una propuesta, la puede mandar en audio en diferentes idiomas, porque ese es otro elemento fundamental, ¿no? La diversidad de los idiomas. En fin. Desde nuestra Escuela Global de Liderazgo, también nosotras tratamos de promover el reconocimiento de la diversidad al momento de conformar el grupo de participantes que van a ser parte de la escuela. Si vamos a conformar una delegación para ir a las Naciones Unidas, por ejemplo, ahora recientemente la COP26, tratamos de tener un balance de regiones, de edades, de experiencia. No vamos a llevar solo personas que tengan una experiencia sobre bosques. También necesitamos compañeras que puedan venir y compartir su experiencia sobre soberanía alimentaria, que también compartan su experiencia sobre autocuidado, sobre espiritualidad, que es fundamental, o el buen vivir. Y también es importante ir reconociendo otras realidades, otras condiciones como lo es las personas con discapacidad, personas indígenas con discapacidad de la comunidad LGTBI. Debo reconocer que desde FIMI nosotras tenemos un trabajo muy incipiente todavía con personas y organizaciones indígenas con discapacidad, principalmente mujeres. ¿Por qué? Porque también autorreconocerse en ese derecho de la autoidentidad no es fácil en las comunidades cuando se tienen otras realidades y otras condiciones como las personas con discapacidad o LGTBI. Entonces, ¿cuál es el compromiso desde la comunidad filantrópica frente a esto? Tal como les decía desde nuestra experiencia, primero, estar dispuestas a reconocer esta diversidad que existe. Tener como la mente abierta, los ojos abiertos a estas realidades. Esto es fundamental para poder comprender cuando una organización, por ejemplo, está en una situación de emergencia, cuando hay necesidad de reaccionar de una manera más cercana, cuando hay que dejar que la organización camine más sola porque ya está en otro contexto. En fin, todo esto nosotros tenemos que conocerlo y entenderlo. Pero también en nuestras guías, en nuestras metodologías, en nuestros mecanismos de facilitar recursos, nosotros tenemos que comprender esas realidades. No es lo mismo trabajar con una comunidad de mujeres indígenas con discapacidad que trabajar con un grupo de jóvenes en otras condiciones que son del área urbana, porque tenemos una esencia similar, pero tenemos realidades diferentes. A esto es lo que nosotros nos referimos del por qué la importancia. Si nosotros somos capaces de reconocer las diversidades, seremos capaces de dar pequeños pasos, pero pasos importantes para promover políticas, programas, planes, guías que tomen esta diversidad. Lo decían las compañeras mujeres indígenas con discapacidad. Si a mí me dan la oportunidad de participar en un evento internacional, deben de considerar que tengo otros requerimientos específicos. Y entonces como comunidad donante no podemos decir, pero ¿por qué se está pagando un boleto tan caro por una persona que va a un evento y la otra persona no? Que además requiere de un apoyo, depende del tipo de discapacidad, posiblemente necesite de una persona que le acompañe, también de una asistencia especial. Son como pequeños ejemplos, pero muy fundamentales en este proceso de reconocimiento de las diversidades. También otro aspecto importante a compartirles es la necesidad de desarrollar capacidades. Nosotros desde FIMI pensamos en que tenemos que transformar la filantropía tradicional del enfoque de solo dar, porque voy a colaborar, porque soy solidaria, porque la fundación tiene una misión de apoyo, perfecto. Pero tenemos que estar abiertas también a recibir. Y cuando recibimos es porque estamos reconociendo que hay capacidades, hay conocimiento, hay experiencia, hay aporte en las comunidades. Y no son comunidades que solo necesitan recibir. Esta es la esencia de la filantropía intercultural. Y para ello es importante desarrollar estas capacidades, confiar en las organizaciones, confiar en los fondos implementadores, porque es la forma en que nosotros podemos permitir que estas organizaciones se fortalezcan, crezcan, sean autónomas y ojalá aquí a unos años no tengamos tantas organizaciones necesitando de la filantropía. O sea, ese es el enfoque, no la dependencia. Entonces, con estas reflexiones, quiero invitarles, motivarnos conjuntamente, porque aquí nosotras también estamos aprendiendo, pero que sigamos trabajando con este enfoque de la reciprocidad, dar y recibir y dar. Esa es nuestra tarea. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias de nuevo. Aquí estamos siempre para aportar y también para aprender. Gracias, Lourdes, y a todos.
Muchas gracias, Tere, por tus palabras y por lo que nos compartes también, lo que se que refiere a la interseccionalidad y las diferentes comunidades dentro de la comunidad indígena. I think, Anka, if you can let me know what's happening is, I think I am turning it over to you briefly.
You are indeed, that's right.
Thank you, Anka.
Thank you. And before I go on, thank you. Muchas gracias, Teresa. Gracias también, Intaya, Janine. Thank you all. And what I will do now is remind everyone about today's core question. As we said, it is, where are we currently and what do we need and want? We just heard from 3 amazing presenters about our breakout rooms, right? So we heard Janine talk about her breakout room number 3, which is going to be about what does solidarity look like for us in addressing the continued impact of racism and colonization on Indigenous peoples globally today. Then we heard from Intaya, who's breakout 5, which is moving forward, decolonizing philanthropy. Where are we and what's needed? And finally, we heard from Teresa, who is breakout 4 of ensuring effective and a meaningful representation of intersectional groups within Indigenous communities. So we're going to hop to break in 1 second. But before we do, I want to invite us all to today's interactive mural. And if someone from the IFIP team could put the link in the chat, that would be great. So for those of you who are new, a quick introduction to mural. You'll first click on the link that IFIP gives you in the chat, in the Zoom chat. And then you enter either with your name or an anonymous animal. I always find the animals to be quite delightful. So you're entering and then you're able to zoom in and navigate just with your mouse pad or trackpad. So you're able to zoom in as I am right here. And then the most important part for today is you have to be able to grasp one of the sticky notes. And you do that just simply by clicking on it. And then you simply start to type in here. Okay. And I'll repeat those instructions one more time and I'll go over them with you in break in about 5 minutes if you need those extra instructions, so no worries on that. What I want everyone to do now is start thinking about and writing in the Post-its your answers to the central question of the interactive today, which is, what do you want to see the IFIP global community bloom into, right? So we're moving now from present to future a bit. What do we want to see the IFIP global community bloom into? More specifically, what would you prioritize? I'm sure there's like a long list and you have an ideal, and maybe in 10 years you would want to see an IFIP that, you know, has everything and does everything and supports and receives in a reciprocal way as well. But what would you prioritize? And then the second question is, how can you support each other in that? So what do you want to see IFIP bloom into? How can you all support each other in doing that? And what would you prioritize? Okay. So I will give you all some minutes to jump in here and start responding these questions. 1 response per Post-it. If you have more than 1 idea or more than 1 response, great. Use up all the Post-its that you want. You can grab them and drag them. I see a visiting penguin, a visiting bird, visiting lions. Susan and Marion. And as we did yesterday, as you write your ideas, please put your institution's name or your name in parentheses if you feel comfortable. have here co-funding opportunities, becoming a global resource, champions for groups with more complex challenges, gathering the wants of Indigenous peoples in philanthropy. It's powerful, building from needs and wants, the communities we represent. Partnerships and collaboration. And also remember to reflect on how can you support each other in doing this as a community, right? Wonderful. Indigenous news and information, possibly similar to a global resource.
How do you save a post-it?
How do you save a post-it? So
Yeah.
Are you able to click on the post-it and write on it?
Yeah.
And then you just unclick and it's right there. So as you all finish, I'm actually going to send everyone off to break for about 10 minutes. So if we can come back at 40 minutes past the hour. Those who have questions on Mural, I'll stay behind. And please, if you have more ideas or if you have ideas coming back from break, come back in the Mural and put them on Post-its. But yes, thank you everyone. And we'll present back what you all did and what Track B did as well. In regards to what they want to see the IFIP community bloom into. We'll present that back to you all tomorrow. So thank you, and feel free to stay on the call, just mute and no video, and we will see you all back here in 10 minutes at 40 past the hour. Thanks everyone. And I'm not sure who asked the question. Sorry, I didn't catch the name or the video, but were you able to save the post-it? If you're still there. Hopefully, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. And if you want to add post-its, you just double click on the mural and then there's the post-it. For the more advanced, it took me a while, but you can change the color here if you want in the little menu of the post-it. Excellent. So we have about 4 more minutes of break. If you haven't, please go get some more water or liquids or eat. We'll come back and we'll do the breakouts. And I am going to start sharing a different screen to get us in the mood for breakouts. All right, so as we start trickling back in, you'll see that I'm sharing a new screen. I'm not sharing the mural anymore, although the mural, we can take a look at it, has really been filled out quite extensively. But this screen that I'm sharing, it's starting to get us a little bit more in the mood for breakouts. These are similar to yesterday. These are the discussion questions that will guide these discussions. So take a look at them and see really what inspires you, because very shortly you'll be selecting just one of the 3 breakout rooms to join. So take a look at the questions as you join back. Hello again. So we're trickling back in. I'm seeing more videos. Hello, welcome back. And what I'm sharing on the screen now are the discussion questions that will guide us in our breakout rooms. So start reading them, right? For breakout 3 on what does solidarity look like for us in addressing the continued impact of racism and colonization on Indigenous peoples. The questions are much more broad, as you can see, right? This is going to be a heavy conversation. So we've left the discussion questions a bit broader. What does solidarity look like for us? How can we support each other in navigating these oppressions, and what roles do we want funders to play? For breakout 4, on effective and meaningful representation of intersectional groups within Indigenous communities, we have what are the gaps and areas of improvement to enhance the representation and participation of intersectional groups. Then how can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional efforts? And finally, how to organize and take concrete steps to bring more intersectional groups into this space. This is already starting to get into a little bit of what we'll see more of in day 3, a more Minka style conversation. And then in breakout 5, moving forward, decolonizing philanthropy, where are we and what's needed? We'll think about what has been done already, but more so, how do we want to move forward? What does it really mean to shift power within your organization? And on a whole, we heard from this, not only from Intaya, but I think from almost all of our speakers touched on this question. And then what are tools that we can co-design and co-create to support this shift? So they're heavy conversations, but we're moving them a little bit more towards action. So these are the 3 breakout groups that we are about to embark on. As a reminder, for those who are joining breakout groups for the first time, welcome. You will have a wonderful facilitator for each of the breakouts, either an IFIP team member, or for breakout 3, it will be Janine. And during those 55 minutes, we'll do a short welcome and have a discussion and also a closeout question. Let me actually show you all an example of the notes docs that you can use as a guide to the discussion. So as you can see, we have a list of the community agreements here. You'll select a group presenter who'll come back and try to present back in about 2 minutes. We're going to try to keep it a little shorter than yesterday, so 2 to 3 minutes. And then here are the questions, right? What has been done, but more so how to move forward. What does it mean to shift power? And what can we co-design and co-create together? And here, this is the most important / exciting part. We're asking you to take collaborative notes. So what your facilitator will do once you get into the group is they'll ask you to think individually first about the first question. And you each will jot some notes down here in a Google Doc, the beauty of a Google Doc. And then you'll have a discussion. And she'll do the same thing for the second question, reflect individually, and then bring it out to a group discussion. Same thing for the third question, reflect first individually here, and then bring it out for the group. So don't worry if you don't have the links, your facilitators have that. They'll share them with you once you get into the breakout groups. But what I will do now is remind us all of the questions, and let me stop sharing. And recording is in progress currently. All right. How was that, everyone? Was it at 55 minutes well spent? Yes, I see a lot of nodding. I saw a lot of notes, but even in the places without notes, I was getting messages that the conversations were really good. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone. So we'll go in the order again. And remember that these present backs are yes for us, but also for track B. So let's try to keep it to about 2 to 3 minutes. And yeah, why don't we start with out 3. That is Janine, your group. Who is presenting back?
I will be. We lost Susan through the discussion. She had to jump off for another call. So we had a small group discussion. There was only 4 of us. So we got to do a deep dive into some real experiences that we all have with seeing how white supremacy and internalized colonization shows up in our movement work, and the work, how difficult it is to navigate that in real situations. And so as part of that conversation, a couple of things came up that were very, despite us representing very different geographies and areas with different histories, there was a lot of consistencies in how white supremacy shows up in our own communities, right? First, in upholding and validating that white supremacy characteristics are problematic and do very much get translated across our geographies through philanthropy, and through sometimes even conservation movements in our areas and on our front lines, and that we have a lot of work to do to name and confront those things and protect our communities from those things. But we also have a lot of work to do to confront the ways that our movements, our peoples, our nations have also internalized these things. And we got to talk about a little of the conflicts that come up, for example, around the discussion of carbon markets, and how we have indigenous peoples on both sides of that issue. And then what does it look like to do our work when there's those types of conflicts, and really honing in on the mandate to really support and uphold the self-determination and inherent rights of indigenous peoples, and letting go of the ways that we can even have like these characteristics of ideas of perfectionism when it comes to building liberation. And I shared a quote from Marx that was from this great reading, analyzing the leftist movement in the United States in particular, but I think also has a lot of relevance over what we're seeing and how these tensions are showing up in our movements across the globe. And it says one of it was our movements and the solutions we're building will bear the birthmark of the womb from which it emerges. And so being conscious of that, I think, helps us be a little bit more aware that we're going to make our own missteps. And what came up in the conversation is that particularly when we think of solutions, we can't think of a cookie cutter solution coming out of a developed nation and being transcribed to Latin America or the African experience, because they have different legacies, different histories of colonization, different political analyses, right, of what their solutions need. And so even in our movements, we have to have that room for that diversity. And we also have to have that comfort with the reality that we are going to fail in some ways, but what can help keep us on the right track is creating strong mechanisms of accountability for ourselves, for the partners that we're engaged with, for the networks that we're engaged with, and the funders we're engaged with, so that our accountability and responsibility to our communities continues to be upheld and continues to center those 4 R's of philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Janine. and I'm really happy that you were able to deep dive in such an important topic. And sometimes the small conversations are the best ones. So thanks for that. Thanks to everyone in the group. Let's head now to breakout group 4, Qualnesca's group. Who's presenting from Qualnesca's group?
Yes, we will. I think Elaine volunteered. So
Elaine.
We covered the questions one by one in an orderly way, but then there's a lot of overlap around what gaps and areas of improvements are needed. Meaningful representation is at the top of the list, not the kind of tokenism that is pretty prevalent in organizations. Greater recognition and inclusion of women, not just access to resources, but the ability to use the resources. Governance within organizations should include strong diversity statements and definitely implement them. Also recognizing that there is increased creativity within the work of an institution that incorporates a wide difference of perspectives. The phrase "community within communities" comes up, where it is interesting and very meaningful when people recognize people with identity challenges or challenges to their identity and can form allyships. On the second question, how can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional efforts? Naturally incorporate a great deal more diversity in staffing, not just the people, but their ideas, be prepared to change and follow different ways of thinking in really forming the objectives of the organization. Things like the allyship was referenced as not a noun, but is an active action, and is probably the greatest outcome for building diversity within an organization. There's also mention of recognizing the need for anonymity, because inclusion doesn't mean people will come in necessarily fully ready to reveal their experience if they have come from an experience of trauma or have come from great vulnerability. Accessibility, recognizing the needs and accommodating the needs of people with disabilities, and also being aware that there are issues that will simply not be addressed by an organization unless someone representing that issue or the needs of a specific community are present, and it's kind of nothing about us without us. Or on the other hand, if our issue is not, if there is not a representative there, our issue is not included at all. And finally, the last one, how to organize and take concrete steps to bring more intersectional groups into the space, participation in the work, the actions, the movement building of other organizations focused on different work is important to for them to also incorporate your work and objectives in their work. Becoming familiar with communities in a non-charitable way, recognizing that what is shared in common. Also, participation is reciprocity. Recognizing how to welcome, how to invite participation, and not just be transactional. I think that's what I picked up.
Well, that was quite a lot that you picked up. Thank you to that group. I saw that note stock. It was very representative of what Elaine was talking about and more. So thank you. And also a reminder that the note stocks will stay open and will be available. So yeah, that they will be there for people who weren't in the breakout groups. And last but not least, I would love to hear from Rachel's group. I think Intaya was there too, on decolonizing philanthropy.
Kim will be reporting back for us.
Thank you, Rachel and Anka and everyone that shared. There's definitely some themes that are coming forth, relationships and trust and all of those things. But in our particular group, the first question, what has been done and how do we move forward? This was probably the line that stood out for most people, is more time listening and less time foundationing. Moving relationships beyond, moving our relationships into a less transactional space and more trust-based, having applications and forms in different Indigenous languages, accessibility of the process, flexibility, really focusing on Indigenous women's agendas and priorities, engaging senior management in decolonizing, more funding to Indigenous-led organizations, sharing resources, and trust in Indigenous management and leadership and how they want to allocate their funds. So that was this question around what has been done and how do we move forward. In the second question, what does it mean to shift power? Look at different models of funding. Participatory grant making process. So having a voice in all levels in what is being funded and what the priorities are, sharing experiences across the entire organization, providing more general support. Transparency. We can't shift power without being transparent. Spend more time listening. Identify who has the power, and that isn't just in title, that goes beyond, whether it's staff or whether it's board, really knowing where the power is in an organization, decolonizing programs offered to the organization. So maybe working with an outside entity, an organization out of Canada was shared called a program called Kinship, and really being able to bring those kinds of learning opportunities to an organization at all levels of the organization. Ensure everyone is at the table, those who have the resources and those that are impacted by those decisions. The mechanisms, this is also, I think, something that was really impactful for everyone, is mechanisms for the community to hold the funders responsible and accountable. Make space for what partners want to tell you as opposed to what you want to hear from them. And ask them, what do you want to tell us? And how do you want to tell us? It's kind of been talked about that these kinds of opportunities to create relationships, really meaningful relationships, are much more challenging in a virtual world, an online world. And how do you build that trust and create that kind of opportunity to really make those relationships meaningful? And then the last question is the tools. Create a centralized application and funding process. So maybe bringing 5 or 6 organizations together, having one application for all of those. Maybe they have similar kinds of funding priorities, and creating a prototype and seeing if that is something that could potentially work. Having an inventory of resources available for grant making, template or guide for open-ended reporting, capacity building for people at staff level within an organization, resources and tools on how to how to get money to organizations that maybe are more challenging to support. So those, and I know that's been talked about in a number of different areas over the last 2 days. Those organizations that maybe aren't fiscally sponsored or don't understand how to register in their home country, and maybe just don't have the resources to understand how to actually create an organization. Video reporting, reporting and funding depending on language, geographical location, technology, and share experiences in participatory grant making, what worked, what didn't work, how to make things better. And yeah, so there. Hopefully I represented everyone well, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And yes, overlap and similar themes across not only the last 2 days. Sorry about that, 1 second. So not only over the last 2 days, but also in the mural that you all just filled out. So that's really exciting to see that a lot of what was discussed in the breakout group is also represented in, individuals' thoughts. So we are, as a collective, the conglomerate of us individuals. So it's really great to see that people are already moving forward with it, and also what we want to see from the IFIP community. So that is amazing. Thank you to all of the facilitators, everyone who presented back, and also to all the participants. These are challenging conversations to have, and I'm really happy that we were all up for the challenge. So with that, we are going to start to close out our day 2 track A here, and I will pass it over to Winnie to introduce the 2 folks who will be helping us do that.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you again and to have such a wonderful discussion for the better part of your morning. And for the next session, I'd like to invite back Pearl and Melina from yesterday, from ICA, who led us into our healing session yesterday. And they're going to be doing the same for the healing session today. And so Pearl and Melina, please, you're welcome to take over.
Tansegwakia, Neo Melina Miowapin Labokam Masmo Nia Nihiao Kineskuntanawao. It's been so nice to hear what's been coming back for the feedback of the discussions that you all have had today. They sound very fruitful and meaningful and very deep. So I'm really happy that I got to listen in on that. Today we are doing the Healing Justice circle again, and so we have some stuff to present to kind of round out this discussion as well. but I will introduce myself first, and then we'll go into more of a discussion and show some PowerPoints and stuff as well. So I'm one of the co-founders of Indigenous Climate Action. I am the director of Healing Justice at ICA, and really happy to be talking to you all today about this work, because I think it's incredibly important as we push for healing justice spaces within our movement spaces, that we also are talking to philanthropy about these very needed places and spaces to support frontline Indigenous land defenders in our work. And I will let Pearl introduce herself really quickly too, and then we'll talk about what brought us to this work quickly.
Sure. Good afternoon, relatives. Hello again from Mexico. I'm going to hope that my Wi-Fi stays strong for the presentation, but if I disappear, I'll come back. It just comes and goes, but should be good. Yes, my name is Pearl Gottschalk, and I currently work as Healing Justice staff for Indigenous Climate Action, and I also work as the program advisor with the Kindle project on the Indigenous Women's Flow Fund. So I'll just pass it back to Melina to tell a little bit about how she came to be in this work.
So like most Indigenous peoples, we inherit this work. I myself, the first time I was on a blockade was at the age of 7. I come from a frontline Indigenous community, a reserve called Little Buffalo, where I was born. And my family and community was fighting against the government and corporations, logging, oil and gas corporations. I was born in the heart of the tar sands, so my community was blocking a road, an all-weather road that was bringing heavy industry into our territory for the first time in the 80s. And so I've inherited this work, and have since, as a teenager, worked on social justice, Indigenous rights, land sovereignty, doing frontline organizing in the climate justice and environmental justice movement. So the past 20 years has been a complete sprint. I'm now 40, so it's been 20 years of sprinting, and I think which probably resonates with most people on this call. And then I got to a place where I actually completely collapsed. I was bedridden. I couldn't even lift a cup of tea. My system just stopped because I just kept going. And I think this is what a lot of us are taught to do, that we become these hyper-productive people, and that we're very valued by that in society, and which is actually a white supremacist value, which we a lot of times don't realize. And so I just kept going and pushing my body past its capacity and healthy boundaries. And so kind of experiencing this complete collapse where I was hospitalized a number of times. I had to go through a lot of testing and still am recovering from this. My realization was kind of like, wow, this is what I've been taught in this work, in this movement, to be able to, we are in crises. So of course there's always, we always need more people. We always need to do this work in a way that a lot of times we are under-resourced, underpaid. And so there's a few of us. And so, fighting against the tar sands, that's definitely how it felt for, a decade plus. And so this is actually why I started the Healing Justice program at Indigenous Climate Action, because I wanted to not perpetuate what we learned outside of ICA in those destructive ways of being, always sacrificing the expense of a person's well-being, oftentimes our families and our communities. And so bringing in trauma-informed ways of being into ICA, and then also into the larger movement spaces. So that's what we'll be talking a little bit more about too today. Hi, I'll pass it back to Pearl.
Thank you, Melina. Yeah, we kind of joke that we're actually now the elders, kind of really burnt out elders, who we want to then advise to the youth of a next generation to not end up kind of like we ended up. And we want to reverse the culture now so that changes for our next inspiring and amazing Indigenous youth to be sustainable through the movement. So yeah, for me, earlier in my life, I worked as a funder as well for 7 years in various organizations. And during that time, there was no institutionalized understanding within our organizations of the importance of healing justice for us as donors or for our grantees. So in 2015, after a devastating experience happened at work, I became unable to work for 4 or 5 years and slowly watched my life unravel. And losing my ability to work at the front lines and as a funder was the single most devastating experience in my life. But during this time, I was lucky to have some financial support and the care of my elders and friends and ceremonial life. And that caused me to start having real and vulnerable conversations with sisters like Melina and Ariel and Crystal Lehman, who I want to name here, because I began to really realize how deeply unjust our systems of care really were. and how the systems of care that do exist are often insufficient and not rooted in traditional culture that's meaningful, or were extremely under-resourced. And often there were systems that we had to fight to gain access to in times when we had no fight left in us anymore. And I decided that when I was well enough, I would speak up for healing justice, especially in philanthropic spaces, because that's the space that I know. And so that's why it's really deeply meaningful to be here with you today, and to really thank you, IFIP, for honoring and beginning this dialogue. So we're going to just launch into a little bit today in our session. We're going to tell you a little bit about the history of healing justice, what ICA is doing and indigenizing it. It's really juicy and awesome. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what philanthropists can do. And then we're going to close out with a nice session with Melina. So we're going to share some slides and do a little bit of talking together. So healing justice itself is both a term and a movement. It was first coined by the Atlanta-based Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective in 2007, and they aim to address widespread generational trauma from systemic violence and oppression by reviving ancestral healing practices and building more new inclusive ones. And healing justice was taken up in a big way by the Black Lives Matter movement and by many key leaders in that movement. And Black Lives Matter has created many great resources. You can Google them, and began bringing healing directly into frontline actions and institutionalizing it within their organizations and encouraging others to do so. So it's become a bit of a movement over the last 5 years. When I started asking around, there was really no one knew what I was talking about. It didn't have a name. So at least now it has some kind of a name, which is good. So while we realize that there's many important Indigenous healing practices already happening around the world that already exist, healing justice itself kind of recognizes the need to bring this into our movement spaces as a whole and put trauma-informed tools into practice in our daily lives and work so we can be the most effective we can be. And it came to be in Canada and with Indigenous climate action, largely by the awareness and the work of Melina and Ariel, who are courageously using their experiences to start the dialogue about healing justice. So I'll let Melina talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. We're going to pull up a slide here, and Anka has so graciously offered to show this slide just to kind of drive these points home a little bit more. The idea that we are not actually sacrifices. I've had many people say, you are such a warrior, you're so strong, you're so resilient, and I was constantly sacrificing my well-being for the movement. And I feel like, that is a very noble thing to do, but it's also a very naive thing to do in the long run, because you become bedridden, you're no longer good to anybody else. So the importance of sacrificing our well-being is actually, we need to flip that script, and we need to understand that we are actually the altar, that we are actually, we deserve to be taken care of. We deserve to honor our well-being. We deserve to allow our body and our lives to be sacred places and spaces to continue this liberation, because our liberation is bound together. So ICA long-term has been looking at how can we create long-term well-being and longevity in our staff and in our movement in general. And so how do we protect and care for one another, and also the younger ones that are coming up. I'll just ask for the next slide to be. So this comes from an Indigenous values, as Pearl was mentioning. We want to honor our Black brothers and sisters who have brought this term, this important term of healing justice, into our movement spaces. And how do we indigenize it? Because like Janine said earlier today, one size does not fit all. We need to ensure that we are indigenizing our practices, because we all have different impacts of colonialism and genocide. We all experience it, but we do experience it in different ways. And so how do we indigenize it? And so for me, my understanding of it, my bedridden lesson when I was laying there just completely unable to do anything, just think in extreme pain, was I have taken myself out of the sacred hoop. I have taken myself out of the medicine wheel. I have not included myself. I have just given everything external and left myself almost, I lost 25 pounds. I was a skeleton. I left myself as a skeleton. And I realized we need to put ourselves back in the sacred hoop, that we deserve to be a part of the sacred hoop, and that our ancestors and our elders would be like, in a way mortified because we haven't been able to create or continue to ensure that we are indigenizing healing. How do we indigenize healing justice? How do we indigenize and decolonize our spaces? And healing justice is a process of decolonization. So we need to move from the view of self-care. That this, I was very, I didn't want self-care to be I thought, oh, that's a selfish thing. It's not a part of our movement, but it's actually, you know, we can indigenize self-care and we can take back it and put it back into a collective movement. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how, you know, we are all these individual spokes in a collective wheel, and that we all need to be taken care of, because if these wheels and these spokes aren't strong, then the wheel breaks. And so that's why it's so important that we ensure that it's not just about individual self-care and, you know, this kind of like idea in Western society of like self-care is this individual thing that you can only access through if you have enough money, if you can go to a yoga retreat, if you can do all these things. I'm so sorry that I'm speaking quickly. My apologies. That is something that I have done with my autonomic nervous system, speaking too fast to try to get the points across quickly in the limited times that we're often given to talk about these things. So thank you for letting me know that. So it is so important as individuals that we have this care circle and that we are a part of the collective, and that we ensure that we are taking care of the individual spokes, because to recognize that the collective will break if we're not taking care of all of these things on this wheel. So if you go to the next slide. Oh no, it's not showing the tiger. I'm not sure what happened there, Pearl, but oh, there he came. So the autonomic nervous system. So this is, you know, what's coming out of neuroscience that is kind of catching up to what's been happening in our movement spaces of how we've been all running on, you know, there's two states that we live in, and there's the sympathetic state and the parasympathetic nervous system state. The sympathetic state, you know, basically there's increased blood flow, like from when we are in a fight and flight mode. So right here with this tiger, we are in a fight and flight mode. So this is how we are oftentimes in our movement spaces, just running in a fight and flight mode, where we actually, when we stay in this state, our blood flows decrease from our brain, and it actually reduces our cognitive functioning. And that actually increases chemical stresses in our systems go up. And so over time, if we stay in this state, the chemicals are actually punching holes in our nervous system. And that, you know, and that's why long-term, many of the people in our movement spaces have disease, have chronic disease, you know, myself included, as well as pretty much most people I know at this age, because we have stayed in a fight and flight biological mode. And so what we need to do is figure out how, not only with our ceremony, we know which sometimes we can access and sometimes we can't access collectively, but how are we dealing and allowing our bodies to go back into a parasympathetic nervous system state where we are actually in a rest and digest state. And so this is where we're bringing in tools into the movement, and trauma-informed tools to pair with our ceremony to bring in healing justice. And I'm going to pass it back to Pearl.
Great, thank you so much. So we just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how philanthropy can support healing justice, because I really like it when I go to a conference and someone just tells me, okay, here's some really clear practical takeaways that you can start doing tomorrow. And maybe some of these will resonate for you and maybe some of them won't. So we'll just kind of do our best. You know, I'm looking at the sea of faces in front of me, and I know so many of you from 10 years in this work. And I know what you guys are doing on the front lines and how hard you work and how diligently and how much you care for this work. And if you were like me, you know, there was nothing I loved more than my work and my job. And we are committed to this for the long term. So let's see how we can start to change some of the systems. Next slide, please. So the place to start is always to start within, and recognizing the important role that philanthropy plays in building collective care systems, kind of shifting the idea from self-care to collective care, starting within anywhere we work, starting today, trying to change the dialogue from, why don't you just go away and take care of yourself, have a bath, take a week off, and come back when you're not burnt out. It's not what we need. It's not the conversation we need. So how do we radically transform our systems of our work, our care, and our giving? Next slide. And it really means starting having creative and courageous conversations and starting this dialogue with words we might not even have. Even Melina and I sometimes were like, we don't even have the vocabulary for this. and really breaking the traditional chains of professionalism and what we do and don't talk about at work, and creating a new language for ourselves in which you can talk not only with each other, but with your grantees, your partners. So and this could look like inviting healing justice leaders into your spaces to inform and educate about where you can start to support this issue, and just allowing healing justice to be a central part of philanthropic conversations, or asking, how come it's not? How come we need more tools on this? So that's why IFIP's very forward thinking and having this here today. And so really for our organization, Indigenous Climate Action, investing in our healing justice pathway is the way that helps elevate the dialogue amongst our staff, but also our wider Indigenous community, that self-care and collective care cannot be separated. And when we strengthen one, we strengthen the whole, like the spokes on the wheel. When one breaks off, the other breaks off. So I kind of just was collecting beautiful images because my mind thinks in images of like, this to me is what is rampant in the nonprofit NGO culture, which is just overworking and being underpaid and burnt out. And studies have shown that 95% of all peace activists actually leave the movement due to burnout within 6 years. We need to actually stop over-romanticizing exhaustion and start owning the ways in which philanthropy has perpetuated this system and what it can do about it. Next slide, please. So really the most important thing I think is supporting the infrastructure of the culture of care for your grantees, for your organization. And that starts with asking radical questions, which can lead to radical change. And actually, when you ask questions of your grantees, be committed to resourcing the answer, even if it's not something that's technically something you would have thought of before. So funders can ask, I love this question, can ask potential grantees if they're thinking about funding or long-term ones, what plans does your organization have in place to ensure the health and well-being and long-term sustainability of your staff and your movements? And if you had resources for that, what would you do? And then actually fund the answers, even if they're new and risky. Next slide, please. So be in it for the long haul. Really, we got to, and this is I'll have Melina just put a blog post in that we just wrote about how important this is for us to encourage and support a holistic approach to our grant making that considers all aspects of your partners, your grantees' humanity, which includes everything from retreats to paid time off to what kind of spiritual and emotional support systems they have. You don't have to be the one to prescribe or have the answer, but very important that we prioritize that. So like Melina said, time to move away from ourselves being, thinking about short-term project funding. That's what I did for a long time. It was project by project, and that was sexy and exciting, and it was fun, but it was not long-term thinking that was really gonna sustain us. So next slide, we need to just start thinking like a marathon, not like a sprint towards the burnout line. Next slide. So really moving the money where the trauma is the deepest. And sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide, but we're just trying to say basically that you could, some ways you could do it is adding in it as a percentage of your budget, say 5% of the budget you write of your grant could actually be going towards healing justice work. And if groups don't even know what that looks like, it's probably because no one's asked them. And for us to actually ask them, that might make them start thinking, hey, we really need this in our work. Thank you for asking us this question. And like we had talked about earlier, just really recognizing and honoring and funding traditional systems of care that might require extra things like medicines, elders, support. So Melina talked about how we're doing that at Indigenous Climate Action too. Next slide. And so this really requires us to invest the time, money, effort, resources into relationship building. So take the time to do that and actually show up at the front lines. I did a talk in New Zealand called Frontline Philanthropy. Like, you gotta feel it to know it, and try to understand at some level what the realities are like for the communities that you serve, even if it means leaving the office and computer screen more, or if it means being in difficult situations. Next slide. And you don't have to know all the answers about how to do everything. There's places like the Wind Call Institute that already do this. They provide retreat spaces. There's already trauma training institutes. And for example, with our recent delegation of our staff that went to the COP conference, we needed to also resource them with before, after, during tools that we didn't know where to find funding for. And a great funder came in and actually gave honorariums to each staff to do health and wellness and for themselves and what they needed, which was really beautiful. Next slide. But that really means that we're going to have to fund outside of the box, and it really means we're going to have to get less attached to our outcomes. And it might mean, because it's hard to report on intangibles, and it might mean that you need to hire a full-time healing justice coordinator. I'm seeing a lot of that happening now, which is exciting. And maybe it means you have to fund things that are out of your realms of, you know, we only fund environmental, but maybe we need to fund things like ritual, spirituality, medicines, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. And so there's these great examples. We don't have a lot of time to go into them, but Melina's going to put in the chat there just a link to the Astria Foundation, and there's great resources on this on their site about this beautiful report that they did with Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and they did case studies on Urgent Action Fund and Groundswell, who are also doing wonderful things such as Groundswell created a wellness fund, a rapid response fund, and a reproductive justice fund, and we're absolutely overwhelmed with their response of the need out there just because they had put it out to ask. So this last quote I just want to say before we move to Melina's closing section is this beautiful quote by Shalini, and she's really talking about the context of this quote was after they had sent all their grantees to retreats, into trainings, into healings, and for resting. Then they came back and actually asked them what had changed. And they said that although their environment hadn't changed, the fight was still the same. They actually, what changed was that their ability was to respond from a healed place in a way that they know that they can sustain that for their lifetimes, and that they know now how to engage with trauma and the trauma of their situations and others' trauma in a very authentic way that ensured their to this work. Really the best outcome we can hope for. So I'm going to pass it back to Melina to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl. So just really quickly, before I go into the closing embodiment section, just wanted to share quickly around the healing justice work that ICA specifically is doing and where we've had to fundraise for exactly what Pearl has been talking about, of fundraising for healing justice staff, including myself and Pearl, to build out our healing justice team, to take trainings and connect and work with experts in this field, so we're not working in silos, to do youth wellness grants, to do COP26 care and support and debriefs, which I think myself and Pearl included didn't ever get support and debrief after attending multiple COPs. Creating trauma-informed tools for staff that eventually can again go out to the larger movement, compiling resources that exist so far, doing outreach and education and presentations like this to inform the field of philanthropy as well as other larger movement spaces, building and connecting to find spaces and places of healing, because there is not a lot of actual physicalized places of healing for Indigenous land defenders to come and gather together, because a lot of times when we are in our homelands, we are literally defending them from encroachment and corporations. So a lot of times we can't even sometimes be in places of healing in our own communities because there is crisis happening. So sometimes we have to go to collective spaces, and you'd be surprised how little spaces of that do exist, unfortunately. And so that's something we're looking at creating more of and working with allies and partners on that. So all of that to close out, I know we've thrown a lot of information at you. But we really wanted to share this with you all because we think it's a really important dialogue that we need to have more and more with funders as well as within our movement spaces as a whole. But to close, I'm going to ask you now to just kind of sit back. You can either put your video on or take your video off, and we're no longer going to stay in the head and stay in the cognitive. You can kind of shake it out, shake out your day. Let out some deep breaths, just kind of shake it out. You don't have to think, you don't have to concentrate as hard. This is a place for you just to kind of integrate the rest of the beauty that is healing justice. And so for me, what I learned, I really want to share this, and I love sharing this box. It's called a box breathing technique, and it really changed my life and my ability to deal with pain and to deal with trauma and to bring you know, what we talked about of the being in a sympathetic into a parasympathetic nervous system to kind of self-regulate and to also co-regulate. So a box breathing technique is actually a lot of frontline, you know, even like firefighters and stuff use this. So it's kind of like the neuroscience that's out there is utilizing these techniques as well. So I'm just going to ask you to sit in your chair, close your eyes if you can. And it's the reason why it's called box is because it's a 4-4-4. And so it's a breathe in 4, a hold for 4, a release for 4, and you do it 4 times. And because we are on limited time, I'm going to do it at least 2 times with you all. And you can do this all for yourself, you know, anytime you want, in the elevator, at home, anytime you need to kind of self-regulate and bring yourself back into a relaxed state. So just breathe a couple of regular breaths in and out. Again, in and out. And I'm just going to count you in. So I'm going to ask you to breathe to count to 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 on your in-breath. Hold now. Counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And release. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you hold it in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And release. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll let you do that on your own one more time. Breathe in. Just count yourself. Hold. And release. So this is homework for everybody. You can do this 4 times. So try to do it yourself 4 times. Just 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. It's really easy to remember. And now I'm going to ask everyone, you can keep your eyes closed. You don't have to open them. To put your hand on your heart. Bring your body into this. You know, we've been in the brain. We're in the cognition in this society, in the places and spaces we live, unfortunately, too much. So bring yourself into your body. If you can, put your hand on your heart. Feel your heart. Feel your body. Feel your toes. Feel your legs. Just, you know, one word. What is one thing, just in your own heart, of how you feel today? One word of gratitude of what you learned today, what connection you might have made today, what you heard that was challenging or unchallenging, or anything that you can potentially extend gratitude for. I think when we feel overwhelmed, we go into this crisis mode and everything piles up. And I'm really challenging myself as well to be in gratitude, because things feel a lot more manageable when you can just think of one thing that you're grateful for, whether it be the water, the air. And then I'm just going to close now, bringing our spirit into this. I'm going to close with a quick prayer in my language. Hai kichimanitu nakukom namusum kihu mahiguan maskwa. Thank you, ancestors, creator, creation, for all that you give us, all that you bring us. Thank you for the water that we've drank today, the air that we've breathed, the connections we've made, the love that we've felt, the challenges that we feel that we're able to address from a kind and gentle place. Thank you for this connection here with one another as we try to make the world around us better than when we first arrived here on Mother Earth. Thank you for IFIP, for bringing people together that care so much about the earth that we live on and our communities, and that we're a part of, the organizations that we're a part of as well. And thank you for all the people here today. Just so much gratitude. Despite the challenge, despite the adversity, all of the gratitude, all of the goodness that comes into our life because of this work as well. I just thank you. Hai kichimenitu. Thank you all so much for joining us today in this work. One question that we're just going to leave you with, either personally or collectively, is how do we create the conditions for healing justice to occur? That's what I'll leave you with today, and I thank you so much for listening to us and being with us in spirit and in heart and minds, all of us. Hi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Melina, for that very necessary session that we've just experienced. And thank you for sharing that with us and for just reminding us of how important it is to take pause and heal, and just listen to ourselves, listen to our bodies, because these are the bodies that work, the ones that do the work that we're doing. And so if we don't take time to just pause and heal our bodies, heal our minds, then we won't be able to give to this work what we are giving to it now. So thank you so much for reminding us of that, and also for giving us something to think about as individuals and as organizations, as foundations, something to think about when it comes to healing justice and taking care of our own, our own colleagues. And just thank you for putting that in mind. And I hope that all of us can go back to ourselves and back to our organizations and start conversations on healing justice. And then we hope that we can continue this conversation even after this, after the retreat. And then thank you everyone again for staying with us until this time. Thank you for coming back again for day 2 and for the rich discussions that we've been having throughout the morning. And we, just gearing up and seeing how these conversations are building up to what we're going to talk about tomorrow on where we're going and, our actions towards, what we're going to do in action. And so thank you again so much. I wish you, I think it's good afternoon for most of you now. And we look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow again for our final day of the retreat. So I wish you good health and a good afternoon and good energies as you continue to do your work until we meet again tomorrow. So have a good afternoon and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.